When the sound of clanking chains reached his ears from afar, he was in the process of excavating his final resting place. Silas Ward had previously etched his identity onto the timber marker, penned his farewell correspondence to no one in particular, and reconciled himself with the prospect of perishing in solitude on this abandoned tract of earth. Yet the noise of metal grinding against stone caused him to halt his digging mid-stroke. His worn fingers clutched the tool's grip, while perspiration fell into the soil that would eventually blanket him. For many months, the elderly cattleman had been making arrangements for this occasion. He had disposed of his livestock, cleared his debts, and destroyed his testament since no one remained to receive his burdens. At 68 years of age, with a cardiac condition that caused irregular rhythms and trembling hands that worsened each dawn, Silas understood his remaining time was limited. The burial site he was creating represented more than simply an excavation in the earth. It served as his ultimate expression of authority over an existence that had stripped away everything he valued. Yet the metallic rattling persisted. The sound grew nearer, joined by the frantic shuffling of tiny feet fighting against weighty iron. Silas emerged from his partially completed burial plot and moved toward the noise, his footwear grinding against the arid ground. The sight that greeted him chilled his blood. A young girl, no older than 12, came into view wearing iron restraints around her feet and hands. Her garment was ripped and soiled. Her face was marked with tears and grime. 3 mounted men appeared from the heat waves behind her, their features concealed under broad-brimmed headwear. The group's leader, a gaunt individual with frigid eyes, grasped the chain connected to the child's neck restraint. The child's gaze encountered Silas's across the dusty courtyard, and in that instant, something transpired between them that neither completely comprehended. Present was a man ready to conclude his narrative, and present was a youngster whose tale might be ending involuntarily. She was being guided like livestock toward an unknown destiny, while he was selecting his conclusion with careful consideration. Silas experienced his heart pounding against his chest, though not due to his medical condition this time. The 3 horsemen had approached close enough for him to observe the cruelty in their faces, the manner in which they regarded the girl as merchandise to be exchanged. The leader expelled saliva into the dust and shouted something regarding requiring water for their mounts. However, Silas scarcely registered the words. His entire focus was on the girl, who had ceased walking despite the chain tugging at her throat. She was gazing at him with eyes that contained more suffering than any child should experience, yet somehow still held a spark of hope. It was the type of expression that could torment a man's sleep or completely alter his life trajectory. But her next whispered words, barely audible over the breeze, would transform everything Silas believed he understood about his final chapter. "Become my father," she murmured, her voice fracturing with desperation that sliced through the desert atmosphere like a weapon. The phrase struck Silas with greater force than any physical assault ever could. This child, bound in chains and shaking with exhaustion, wasn't requesting water or liberation or rescue. She was asking for something far more profound and frightening. The leader of the 3 men, whom Silas could now observe wore a deputy's insignia that appeared suspiciously tarnished, chuckled at the girl's plea. "Don't pay attention to her, elderly man. She's been speaking nonsense all morning. We're transporting her to her new household. People who paid substantial money for a healthy laborer." Silas experienced something cold settling in his stomach. Laborer. They weren't discussing adoption or family. They were discussing enslavement, concealed behind legal documentation and false pleasantries. The girl's eyes never departed from his face, and he could perceive she understood precisely what awaited her. She had selected this moment, this stranger excavating his own grave, as her final hope for anything resembling compassion. The deputy dismounted and approached closer, his hand positioned casually on his firearm. "Name's Clyde Baxter. We require water and supplies. Then we'll continue our journey. No conflict intended." However, his delivery carried an undertone of menace, as if conflict might arrive here, regardless of intentions. Silas observed the girl again, truly examined her beneath the dirt and fear. He could detect strength in her small frame, intelligence in her dark eyes, and something else, a fierce determination that painfully reminded him of his deceased wife. Margaret had looked at him the same way once during their initial meeting, as if she could see beyond his rough exterior to something worth fighting for. The girl stepped forward despite the chain's resistance, her shackles scraping against the ground. "Please," she said louder this time, "I can labor diligently. I can prepare food and clean and care for animals. I won't cause any problems. Just don't allow them to take me." Clyde Baxter's expression darkened. "That's sufficient from you." He jerked the chain, causing the girl to stumble forward. "Elderly man, we need that water now. Then we'll be departing with our property." Property. The word lingered in the air like a curse. Silas felt his hands form fists at his sides, a fury building within him that he hadn't experienced since the day they lowered Margaret into the ground. This girl wasn't property. She was someone's daughter, someone's hope, someone's future being sold to the highest bidder. Yet Silas was merely one aging man with a failing heart and trembling hands, confronting 3 armed riders who had the law supporting them. What could he possibly accomplish against such odds? The wise course would be to provide them water, observe their departure, and return to excavating his grave in peace. However, as he looked into the girl's eyes, he realized that some decisions define a man's entire existence, and what occurred in the following minutes would determine whether Silas Ward died as the broken, isolated man he'd become, or if he could discover one final opportunity to be the protector he'd always desired to be. "I don't believe I have sufficient water for all of you," Silas said slowly, his voice steady despite the tempest building within his chest. It was a falsehood. His well was deep and reliable, but he required time to think, time to determine how to save this child, without getting them both killed in the process. Clyde's eyes narrowed. "That's a problem, elderly man. See, we've been riding hard for 2 days, and our horses are nearly exhausted. You wouldn't want to be responsible for what occurs when desperate men can't obtain what they need." The other 2 riders dismounted now, their movements deliberate and menacing. One was a heavy-set man with scars across his knuckles, the other younger, but with lifeless eyes that suggested he'd already witnessed too much violence. They spread out slightly, a practice formation that Silas recognized from his own days running with rough crowds decades ago. The girl, Mercy, seemed to sense the tension building. She looked between Silas and her captors, then made a decision that surprised everyone. She sat down hard in the dirt, her chains clattering, and refused to move. "I'm not going any further," she announced, her young voice carrying a strength that contradicted her circumstances. "Like hell you're not," Clyde snarled, jerking the chain attached to her collar. But Mercy had wrapped her legs around a fence post, using her small size to her advantage. The more he pulled, the more she dug in, her face set with determination. Silas watched this display of courage from someone barely into her teens and felt something crack open inside his chest. Here was a child willing to fight for her freedom with nothing but stubbornness and hope, while he'd been ready to abandon life entirely. The contrast shamed him in ways he hadn't expected. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be, girl," the heavy-set man growled, stepping forward with his hand on a leather strap that looked well used. "We have methods of making stubborn ones cooperate." That's when Silas made his choice. He walked to his porch and picked up the old rifle that had been collecting dust there for years. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady as stone as he checked the chamber and found it loaded. Margaret had always insisted he keep it ready, even though he'd never expected to need it for anything more dangerous than coyotes. "Gentlemen," Silas said, his voice carrying across the yard with newfound authority, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. See, this young lady just requested to be my daughter, and I'm inclined to accept her proposal." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Clyde's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw how comfortable Silas looked holding that rifle. But what none of them knew was that accepting Mercy's request would cost Silas everything he had left to give, and more than he ever imagined he possessed. "You cannot simply claim her, elderly man," Clyde said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "We have papers, legal documents stating she belongs to the Morrison family up in Silver Creek. They paid good money for her services." Silas kept the rifle trained on the 3 men while his mind raced. Legal papers meant judges and sheriffs, and a system designed to protect men like these while sacrificing children like Mercy. But legal didn't always mean right. And Silas had learned long ago that sometimes a man had to choose between following the law and following his conscience. "Funny thing about papers," Silas replied, stepping closer to where Mercy still clung to the fence post. "They tend to burn real easy in this dry climate. Amazing how documents can just disappear." The younger rider with the dead eyes spoke for the first time, his voice flat and cold. "You're threatening to destroy legal documents. That's a serious crime. Old man. Could get you hanged." Mercy looked up at Silas with something like wonder in her eyes. No one had ever stood up for her before. Not when her parents died. Not when the state declared her a ward to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Not during the long journey that had brought her here. This old man with the sad eyes and gentle voice was willing to risk everything for a stranger. "Tell you what," Silas said, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "I'll make you boys a deal. You turn around, ride back the way you came, and forget you ever saw this place. In return, I won't have to explain to the territorial marshal why 3 armed men were found dead on my property while attempting to kidnap a child." Clyde laughed, but it sounded forced. "You think you can take all 3 of us, old man? You're fooling yourself." Silas smiled grimly. "Maybe, but I guarantee you won't all ride away from here. Question is, which one of you wants to be the first to find out if this old rifle still shoots straight?" The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. The heavy-set man's hand twitched toward his weapon, but Clyde held up a warning finger. These weren't lawmen. They were bounty hunters with fake badges, and they knew that killing a property owner on his own land would bring more trouble than any reward was worth. "This ain't over," Clyde finally said, backing toward his horse. "The Morrison family paid us to deliver the girl, and we don't leave jobs unfinished. We'll be back with more men, proper authority, and enough firepower to settle this properly." As the 3 men mounted their horses, Mercy finally released her grip on the fence post. Her shackles had cut into her wrists during the struggle, leaving bright red marks against her pale skin. She looked up at Silas with tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of gratitude mixed with something deeper. "Why?" she whispered as the riders disappeared into the heat shimmer. "Why would you risk everything for someone you don't even know?" Silas lowered the rifle and looked down at this brave child who had somehow awakened something in him that he thought was dead forever. The answer came to him with surprising clarity. But what he told her next would seal both their fates in ways neither could imagine. "Because," Silas said, kneeling down to meet Mercy's eyes at her level, "sometimes God sends us exactly what we need when we need it most, even when we're too stubborn to ask for it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key, one he'd been carrying for reasons he couldn't explain. It fit the locks on her shackles perfectly, as if fate had been planning this moment all along. As the heavy chains fell away from her wrists and ankles, Mercy rubbed the raw skin where the metal had chafed. "I was digging my own grave when you showed up," Silas continued, helping her to her feet. "Figured I had nothing left to live for. But maybe I was wrong about that." Mercy looked toward the half-finished hole in the ground, then back at Silas with new understanding. "You were going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The wooden cross with his name carved into it told the whole story. "Seemed like the right idea this morning," Silas admitted. "Lost my wife 10 years ago, never had children. Spent most of my life making mistakes I couldn't fix. But then a brave little girl asked me to be her father, and suddenly everything changed." They walked toward the house together, Mercy moving carefully on legs that had been bound for days. Inside, Silas poured her water from his well and watched as she drank it like it was the finest wine. When she finished, she looked around the small cabin with its simple furniture and dusty corners. "It's perfect," she said quietly, and Silas knew she meant it. After sleeping on the ground and eating scraps, this modest home must have seemed like a palace. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many more than before. Through the window, Silas could see at least a dozen riders cresting the hill, led by Clyde Baxter and a man wearing an official badge that looked genuine this time. "They came back faster than I expected," Silas muttered, checking his rifle. But he had maybe SI. Moments would surprise even him. The man with the genuine badge dismounted and approached the cabin with authority in every step. "Silas Ward," he called out. "I'm Marshal Tom Henley from Silver Creek. I need you to come out here with the girl. Hands visible, no weapons." Silas looked down at Mercy, who was gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. He could see the terror in her eyes, but also something else, a fierce determination that reminded him why he'd made